Detroit, 1969. Ford engineers create the smartest V8 ever built. 429 cubic inches of fury meant to crush Chrysler's Hemi. But the same tech that made it invincible also made it impossible to race. How did Ford's dream engine become its biggest embarrassment? Let's see why. The engine that forced Ford into a secret war. Every great rivalry begins with humiliation. By mid-1968, Chrysler's 426 Hemi ruled NASCAR like a crown. It powered the Daytona 500 winners, the superspeedway kings, the cars that seemed untouchable. Ford's pride cracked every time a Hemi-powered Plymouth passed its galaxies on the back stretch. Therefore, Ford executives made a quiet decision in Dearborn. If they couldn't outmuscle Chrysler with production engines, they would build something new from the ground up, something the rulebook had never seen. Engineers inside Ford's 385 series division started sketching a monster. It would share the displacement of Ford's new 429 block, but nothing else. The heads looked alien, huge aluminum pieces with canted valves and crescent-shaped chambers that aimed air like a rifle barrel. Early drafts showed power targets past 500 horsepower and safe revs over 7,000 RPM. That level of breathing was unheard of for a full-size racing V8. It meant NASCAR speed on aircraft engine airflow. However, NASCAR's homologation rule required that every engine be sold in at least 500 street-legal cars. Ford had to hide its racing weapon in plain sight. The Mustang became the disguise. It was small, stylish, and had space in the lineup for a halo model. Therefore, the plan was simple but risky. Stuff the race motor into a showroom Mustang, call it the Boss 429, and meet the letter of the rule. When Cale Yarborough won the 1969 Atlanta 500 in a Wood Brothers Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 2 running a Boss-headed 429, Ford's gamble paid off instantly. The new engine had arrived and it had conquered on debut. Yet inside Ford, engineers already knew they had unleashed something too complex, too expensive, and maybe too wild to control. The war with Chrysler had just entered its most dangerous phase, and the Boss 429 was about to change everything. The plan to outsmart the Hemi with air and fury. In 1968, Chrysler's 426 Hemi ruled every big oval. Ford engineers knew they couldn't win by copying it. They had to outsmart it. The plan wasn't about brute power. It was about breathing. They studied airflow, combustion speed, and valve geometry until they found something radical. Instead of a full hemispherical head, like the Hemi, they created a crescent chamber, halfway between a wedge and a dome. It gave the same high-speed flow, but added better swirl and burn efficiency. They called it the semi-Hemi. It wasn't just shape, it was science. The valves were tilted in two directions, canted at wild angles, so the mixture charged in like a storm. Each intake valve measured about 2.28 inches, massive for the time, and the ports looked big enough to lose a wrench in. When the team saw the airflow numbers, over 310 cubic feet per minute, they knew they had something Chrysler hadn't imagined. However, building an engine that could rev past 7,000 RPM meant everything else had to survive that stress. So Ford used a forged steel crank, beefy 4-bolt mains, and aluminum heads that could take racing temperatures. Every piece had one mission: hold together at 200 miles per hour. The block came from Ford's new 385 series family, a fresh design ready to replace the old 427S. It was lighter, stronger, and built for long NASCAR runs. The goal was clear: out-rev, out-breathe, and outlast the Hemi. The engineers even gave it a nickname: Shotgun. The sound of open headers at full throttle made the name fit perfectly. Drivers said the torque hit like a hammer at 4,000 RPM and never stopped climbing. Therefore, The Boss 429 wasn't just built to race, it was designed to embarrass Chrysler. But there was one problem. The engine was too big for any car Ford built, and that meant another secret team had to step in to make it fit. The secret shop that built Legends Ford had the engine. They just needed a home for it. The Boss 429 was too wide for any regular car. The heads stuck out past the shock towers, and the intake sat so tall, the hood couldn't even close. Ford's factories couldn't handle that kind of surgery. Therefore, they called in a small company that had already done the impossible for them, Kar Kraft in Brighton, Michigan. Kar Kraft wasn't a normal shop. It was Ford's quiet skunkworks, where engineers built prototypes, race cars, and experimental parts that never appeared in brochures. In 1968, when the Boss project reached crisis point, Kar Kraft turned a corner of its warehouse into a custom line. Brand new Mustang bodies arrived from Dearborn with their Cobra jet engines still warm. Workers stripped them bare within hours. Then they cut and reshaped the front end until the huge 429 block could slide in. Each car was assigned a special number starting with 1, KK-1201. By the time the run ended, the last car wore KK-2558. That code became a badge of honor among collectors decades later. Ford engineers dropped by the Brighton shop weekly, watching as each car was built by hand, one at a time. There were no robots, no conveyor belts, just welders, torches, and rulers. However, every modification changed something. The front suspension had to move outward, the steering geometry adjusted, the firewall trimmed. The team designed custom motor mounts and a slim brake booster just to clear the valve covers. It was a full re-engineering job disguised as a production car. The first Boss 429 Mustang rolled out early in 1969. To the public, it looked like a regular Mustang with a scoop and a badge. But inside Ford, everyone knew it carried an engine meant for war. Each Kar Kraft build was a secret handshake between racers and engineers, street-legal proof that Ford had outsmarted the rulebook again. Mustang, that had to be rebuilt from the inside out. When the first 429 block showed up at Kar Kraft, the crew laughed. The thing looked like it belonged in a dump truck, not a pony car. The aluminum heads stretched wide, and the valve covers brushed the strut towers before the engine even touched the mounts. Therefore, the only way forward was surgery, deep, painful, and permanent. The team cut into the front end of each Mustang like doctors working under pressure. They moved the shock towers outward by almost 2 inches, hand-welded new braces, and reworked the suspension geometry so the wheels stayed straight. Then they built custom motor mounts, one-offs that existed nowhere else. Even the brake booster had to shrink, replaced with a slimmer unit just to clear the massive valve covers. Ford's battery went to the trunk to help balance the nose-heavy setup. It gave the car a unique feel, with more bite in the rear when accelerating. A new sway bar appeared under the back, the first time a factory Mustang ever got one. Every change had a purpose. Fit the motor. Save the balance. Keep it street legal. However, the changes didn't stop there. The front spoiler had to be shallower. The hood gained a scoop tall enough to swallow air at speed, and the entire stance dropped about an inch. Even the front springs came from a special batch built just for this project. Kar Kraft engineers joked that each car shared more in common with a race car than with the Mustang parked next to it on the dealer lot. By the time a Boss 429 left Brighton, it felt different. The doors shut heavier, the steering was tighter, and the ride had a strange, poised aggression. Each one looked calm on the outside, but carried the soul of a NASCAR engine waiting to breathe. The numbers game that changed. NASCAR forever. By 1969, NASCAR had one rule every automaker hated. To race it, you had to sell it. The engines blasting around Daytona or Talladega had to come from real cars people could buy. Therefore, Ford took its wildest motor, the 429 Semi-Hemi, and stuffed it into a Mustang so it could legally run in NASCAR. The minimum was 500 cars. Ford built far more, 1,359 in total, just to be safe. That meant 1,359 street cars carrying a NASCAR heart under the hood. Each one sold for around $5,000, nearly double the price of a basic Mustang. Ford didn't care about profit. They cared about paperwork. They needed that signature from NASCAR that said, "Approved." However, there was another twist. The Mustang was never meant to race. It was just the delivery system for the engine. The real racers were the Torino Talladega and the Mercury Cyclone Spoiler II, long, low, and slippery cars designed to slice through air. But thanks to that Mustang deal, the Boss 429 engine was legal for all of them. Ford's timing was perfect. On March 30th, 1969, Cale Yarborough took a Wood Brothers Mercury Cyclone to victory at the Atlanta 500. The Boss 429's first big race. The new motor had done what it was built for, outrun the Hemi. NASCAR fans saw a Ford cross the line, but the win came from the same Semi-Hemi sleeping inside those few hundred Mustangs on dealer lots. Collectors now look at those numbers, 1,359 total, with 859 built in 1969 and 499 in 1970, as the golden key to the Boss legend. Each car was more than rare. It was a physical signature on one of Ford's boldest plays in racing history. The Semi-Hemi inside the Boss 429, how it really worked. The Boss 429 hides its wild heart behind calm badge work, but peek under the hood and you find heads that look like race engines in street clothes. Therefore, the term Semi-Hemi fits perfectly. Ford described the chambers as crescent, canted at about 30 degrees. The intake valves measure roughly 2.28 inches, the exhaust around 1.90, bigger than most big blocks of its time. Unlike classic wedgehead engines, these used a dry deck design. Instead of a standard head gasket, every cylinder, water passage, and oil channel got its own metal O-ring seal. That meant stronger structure and better heat control. On all cylinders explained how the race-intended versions used true Hemi-type heads with even larger valves and ports. The block comes from Ford's 385 series big blocks introduced in 1968, built for the 429 and 460. But the Boss headgear is unique. Aluminum, enormous port volume, simple but brutal in intent. Engineers chose a 4.36-inch bore and 3.59-inch stroke for the 429, so revving was possible without that common big block lumber. Street model Boss 429s came with a 735 cubic feet per minute, Holley 4-barrel carb and iron manifolds to meet emissions and drivability rules. However, Ford's race-only 429s dumped restrictions, used bigger intake manifolds, and pushed past 7,000 RPM easily. The real capacity of that head design only showed up when restrictions fell away. Designing for high RPM meant every internal part had to be tough. Forged steel crank, forged rods, 4-bolt mains. Engineers wanted a motor that could pull at speed over and over without giving up. Vintage spec sheets show the street car at 375 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque, Ford's safe numbers. But tuners found 500-plus horsepower easy with minimal work. The twist is that this engine, made for NASCAR, lived in a Mustang, but it breathed like a race car. So the Boss 429 really embodied street car meets oval track in every bolt. The next chapter dives into how power and reality diverged, how those 375 horsepower became something far more intense. The real power. Hidden behind the factory numbers, Ford told the world the Boss 429 made 375 horsepower. Everyone nodded and wrote it down. But inside race shops and garages, nobody believed that number for a second. The people who knew the engine's bones understood it could do much more. Therefore, the 375 rating was a disguise, one meant to keep insurance agents calm and the public curious. In truth, the Boss 429 was built like a weapon. The crankshaft was forged steel, the connecting rods were forged, and the main caps had 4 bolts. Every part inside screamed high strength. Those heads flowed air like no other Ford V8 at the time. The intake ports were massive, and the valves looked like they belonged on a jet engine. Some builders said it could move more air than Chrysler's 426 Hemi once the revs climbed above 6,000. However, the street version wore a small 735 CFM Holly carb, mild cam timing, and tight exhaust manifolds. Ford engineers needed it to pass emissions and start easily in cold weather. That's how the Boss 429 got its quiet rating. But once tuners changed the cam, opened the exhaust, and bolted on a bigger carb, the numbers exploded. Dyno runs in the early 70s showed 500 horsepower without even touching the bottom end. By 1970, Ford switched to solid lifters and a hotter cam, giving the car a sharper bark and more top-end bite. Race-prepped versions on NASCAR dynos touched 600 horsepower. Some insiders said they saw 700 with special fuel and tuning. Yet on paper, Ford kept the same calm 375 horsepower sticker. It was corporate chess. Make the engine street legal, but keep its real power in the shadows. Therefore, the Boss 429 became a legend for what it could do off the record. It looked like a muscle car, but acted like a race car in disguise, and everyone who drove one knew it. The rule changes that killed the giant. Before it could rule, by 1970, the Boss 429 finally had everything it needed: power, speed, and a few hard-won victories. Then NASCAR changed the rules overnight. The timing could not have been worse. New regulations limited engine size and slapped restrictor plates on anything over 7 liters. Therefore, the very engines built to dominate were suddenly too big to run at full strength. Ford had just found its rhythm. Cale Yarborough's Mercury Cyclone had already proven the 429's bite by winning the 1969 Atlanta 500. But by the next year, NASCAR wanted smaller, safer, and more production-like engines. That meant the Boss 429's future was already shrinking. The Aero cars, Ford's Talladega and Mercury's Spoiler 2, also faced cuts. NASCAR gave them a brutal choice: smaller 305 cubic inch engines or stay home from the superspeedways. However, the biggest blow came from inside Ford itself. Late in 1970, the company pulled back factory racing support. Budgets were slashed, engineers reassigned, and teams were left on their own. The total performance era that gave birth to the GT40, the Cobra Jet, and the Boss 429 was ending. The energy crisis and changing politics around racing made the company nervous. What started as a war to beat Chrysler turned into a quiet retreat. Some teams kept using leftover Boss 429 engines through 1971, mixing them with older FE 427 engines for short tracks. But the golden days were gone. The 429 never got to prove its full potential under the new rules. It was built for speedways, for 7,000 RPM runs, for brutal power. NASCAR had moved on before the engine reached its limit. Therefore, the Boss 429 became a short legend, a weapon built for a battlefield that vanished mid-war. The rules may have stopped it, but its legend grew stronger with every year that followed. The Boss that refused to die, from NASCAR to the drag strip. When NASCAR turned its back on big engines, the Boss 429 refused to go quietly. The racers who had spent years tuning it weren't ready to give up. Therefore, the engine found a new home, where rules mattered less and noise mattered more. The drag strip. By 1970, Ford's official racing department was shutting down, but the Boss 429's parts kept moving through back doors and private shops. Engines that once screamed on ovals started landing in superstock Mustangs, and even a few Mercury Cougars built for match racing. Drag racers loved it because it could handle abuse, high compression, wild camshafts, and endless full throttle passes. Gas Ronda and Dyno Don. Nicholson were among those who experimented with Boss-powered drag cars. Nicholson's early Pro stock builds tested combinations using the Boss heads with Cleveland blocks and custom manifolds. Holman Moody, Ford's legendary race shop, sold Spider intake manifolds to private teams who wanted every ounce of top-end flow. Some of these cars ran on nitro blends, revving well past what Ford ever dared on the street. However, this new chapter wasn't about rules or trophies. It was about survival. The Boss 429 had no corporate budget, no team trucks, no TV spotlight. It lived on through mechanics, speed freaks, and small-town drag racers who refused to let it die. Even in the 1980s, old Boss blocks were still showing up in custom builds, each one passed down like contraband from the golden years. Therefore, while the NASCAR world moved on to small engines and safer cars, the Boss 429 kept its soul alive through raw, unfiltered racing. It proved that great engines never fade. They just find new places to roar. From homologation tool to $500,000 icon. The Boss 429 started life as paperwork for NASCAR, but it ended up becoming a crown jewel of American muscle. When the racing ended, the story of the car itself began. Therefore, what began as a project to beat Chrysler's Hemi turned into one of the most collectible Fords ever made. Only 1,359 streetcars rolled out of Kar Kraft between 1969 and 1970. Each carried its own KK number, stamped like a secret signature. KK 1201 was the first, KK 2558 the last. Every single one was hand-built, fitted, and tested before heading to showrooms. At about $5,000, the Boss 429 cost twice as much as a base Mustang, which explains why many sat unsold for months. Dealers struggled to move them, unaware they were holding history. However, time changed everything. When muscle cars faded in the 1970s, the Boss 429 quietly grew in legend. People started realizing how extreme it was. An aluminum-headed, dry-deck semi-Hemi stuffed into a Mustang by hand. By the 1990s, collectors began hunting them down. Documentation became vital. Having the Kar Kraft number meant everything. Today, correct cars often bring $400,000 to $600,000, and top-shelf examples can push even higher. The appeal runs deeper than money. The Boss 429 captures the wild moment when car companies built road-legal race machines just to meet a rule book. It's mechanical proof of how far Ford went to win. 4-bolt mains, O-ring heads, canted valves, and a block that could turn 7,000 RPM. Even in modern terms, that's extreme. Therefore, the Boss 429 stands as a time capsule of pure competition, sealed inside steel. Modern builders like John Cossey have revived it with the Boss 9, keeping the spirit alive for new generations. What started as a loophole in 1969 ended as one of the most feared and loved engines ever built. A true legend that refused to fade. Legends fade, but engines like this never die quietly. Click the next video on your screen right now before it disappears. It continues this story and reveals what really happened next.